Good day. Today is Friday, 8th August 2025. It happens to be the day when Donald Trump's ultimatum of, was it 2 weeks ago, basically runs out. So supposedly today is the day when sanctions and tariffs are to be imposed on Russia and its trading partners, given that there is currently no deal in place between Ukraine and Russia. I mention this because it's completely unclear at the present time whether this deadline remains in effect or not. But as I will discuss briefly, it seems to me, based on comments that the President, Donald Trump himself, made yesterday, that the ultimatum has been, in effect, if you will, extended until the date of the Putin-Trump summit meeting, a date which Fox News says is the 11th of August, though I have strong reasons to doubt that, in fact, the summit meeting will indeed take place on that day. Now, I say all of this. Yesterday, 7th August, was an extraordinary, bewildering, incredibly confusing day. You need a very level head to avoid getting spun along by all of the various things that were being said, and being said, I should say, principally in Washington. Let's first of all begin by certain comments of the Russian president, President Putin. President Putin has been, as always, extremely busy. He's met the King of Malaysia, the President of the UAE. He's had various discussions with various important officials, including, incidentally, the head of the Donetsk regional government, Denis Pushilin. And he started today, by the way, with a meeting of his Security Council in Moscow. He's also, according to news reports, having telephone conversations with a succession of world leaders, leaders who are friends and allies of Russia, briefing them about his conversations with Steve Witkoff a few days ago. So he's called, we know this for a fact, he's called the president of Uzbekistan, the president of Kazakhstan, and according to the Chinese media, he is also called President Xi Jinping. And in fact, I'm sure that is a very important call, and no doubt we will be getting readouts from the Russians about all of these calls before very long. He's also, and I'll come to this later, met with Prime Minister Modi's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval. Anyway, over the course of these intense meetings, and this is very typical of Putin, he always keeps an incredibly punishing rate of meetings. On one particular day, he apparently attended 35 meetings in the space of, well, a single extended day. Apparently, a more normal number of meetings that he attends on any particular day is around 20. That gives you some idea of how intense Putin's timetable on any particular day is. But anyway, alongside all of these other meetings, Putin nonetheless yesterday found the opportunity at 3 o'clock Moscow time to speak to the media. And I'm going to read out what he said. It was one of those very brief meetings with the Russian media, the Kremlin press pool, that Putin engages in from time to time. The meeting took place, I should say, in the Kremlin itself, and the timing of the meeting shows that it took place shortly before the meeting with the president of the UAE. Anyway, this is what Putin said. Given the recent news about your upcoming meeting with President Trump, who initiated it? And then Putin replied, both sides expressed interest. At this point, who reached out first is no longer relevant. Well, the Russians have already said that it was the Americans who reached out, and as I discussed extensively in my program yesterday, the sequence of events makes no other sense. Definitely, it was the Americans who reached out to the Russians. In fact, it's clear to me from the events of yesterday, or rather, the last couple of days, that Trump sent Witkoff to meet with Putin in order to persuade Putin to agree to this summit meeting. But Putin knows better than to get into an argument about this actually not unimportant point with Donald Trump. This is an issue that he can afford to put aside. And he said, well, it's equally important for both of us, so who initiated it really doesn't matter. Anyway, let's move on. Question. Could you clarify, please? Your aide, Yuri Ushakov, mentioned that the meeting will likely happen next week. Do you have any details on the location? Even just a hint. And then Putin gives a hint. We have many friends willing to help organize such events. One of them is the president of the United Arab Emirates. The exact venue is still being decided, but the UAE would be one of the suitable options. And in fact, as I said, he's had meetings with the president of the UAE. The president of the UAE in its totality, very good friends of Russia, very good friends of the United States. It's an obvious place to hold a summit meeting between Trump and Putin. Now, I said a moment ago that I have serious doubts about the Fox News report that the meeting between Putin and Trump will take place on the 11th of August. And one of the reasons why I doubt that this is true is because Fox News said that the meeting would take place in Rome. I think it is inconceivable that the meeting will take place anywhere on the territory of the European Union. And of course, Rome, the capital of Italy, is located in the European Union. To remind again, Putin is subject to a warrant from the International Criminal Court. All of the various European states are signatories of the Rome Statute, which is not called the Rome Statute for any other reason than the fact that it was signed in Rome. This is the statute which set up the International Criminal Court. It is inconceivable that Putin would, or that the Russian authorities would allow Putin to be placed at risk by entertaining the possibility of a summit meeting with the US president on the territory of the European Union. And in fact, just as I'm making this comment, I've seen flash up a comment from the Russian news agency TASS, the official news agency TASS. It says that a source told TASS, this is a source within the Russian government, that Rome as a venue is out of the question, not Europe. Europe will not suit as a meeting place. So we can forget about that Fox report about the summit meeting itself happening in Rome on the 11th of August. Another meeting might take place on the 11th of August, and conceivably it might be in Rome, but it won't be the meeting between Putin and Trump. Now, to move on, Putin was asked if he could give a hint of where the meeting might take place. He says that one of them is the president of the United Arab Emirates, the friends that Russia has. We have many friends willing to help organize such an event. Well, to me, that looks like a hint. And in fact, TASS was reporting earlier today that the meeting will take place in an Arab country, or is likely to take place in an Arab country, and that looks like, to me, the UAE. The only objection, I would have thought, to holding the meeting in the UAE, presumably in Abu Dhabi, is if there is some objection from the US side, but I can't see why there would be. And then we have the most important question, and the one which I alluded to, I touched on briefly over the course of my program yesterday. I said yesterday that there were reports circulating that Putin had denied or had made clear that he did not want to meet Zelensky at the bilateral summit meeting with Trump. And, well, we now have the confirmation. And the question was this: what about Zelensky? Will you be meeting with him? And Putin replied as follows: I have said repeatedly that I have no objection to meeting with him in principle. It is possible, but certain conditions must be in place first. Unfortunately, we are still far from that point. Now, the conditions that must be met for there to be a summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky is that there must be a framework agreement to agree a peace. This is what the Russians have repeatedly said. This is what Putin himself has repeatedly said. We are, as Putin correctly says, very far from that point yet. And for that reason, Putin is basically saying that he doesn't think it's appropriate for him to meet Zelensky at this time. This is a typically polite way of Putin saying no to the whole idea of a tripartite summit, of Trump, Zelensky and Putin all meeting together, photos of the three of them sitting round a table, presumably Trump in the middle, acting or purporting to act as a mediator between the two, agreeing the terms of ceasefires or frozen conflicts or whatever. Putin doesn't want to be put in that position. He doesn't want those kind of photos to circulate. And he says, I am not prepared to meet with Zelensky at this time. Now, after reports of Putin's words appeared and circulated in the United States, something very interesting began to happen in the United States. Firstly, we had a report in the New York Post, a strongly Republican newspaper, staunchly pro-Trump, that a US administration official had briefed the New York Post that for the US, for Trump, a meeting between Putin and Zelensky's participation in the summit meeting between Putin and Trump was an absolute condition of the meeting taking place at all. If Putin was not prepared to meet with Zelensky, then the meeting between Putin and Trump would not take place. So that report appeared in the New York Post. Now, the New York Post is one of America's oldest newspapers, set up by none other than Alexander Hamilton. So that tells you what an old newspaper it is. As I said, it is staunchly Republican, staunchly pro-MAGA, staunchly pro-Trump. It was the newspaper that launched the story about Hunter Biden's laptop, just saying. And it is the kind of place where a genuine Trump administration official might provide a leak. I can imagine that such a person might prefer to run with a story like that in the New York Post than in sort of more liberal media, like, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post. I also have to say that as an occasional reader of the New York Post, it does have very much of a tabloid feel about it, or at least it does to me. And inevitably, that makes it feel rather less reliable. And when I did read this story the first time, I did ask myself, can this be true? I mean, is there really a Trump administration official briefing the New York Post in that way. I mean, to say it again, the New York Post does publish real does do real reporting. As I said, it ran with the Hunter Biden laptop story, and its reporting there was vindicated. So I may be doing the newspaper an injustice. It's just, as I said, that its style tends to weaken its credibility in my eyes. Anyway, a few hours later, it seems to me that the question was put beyond doubt, because ABC News, a completely different type of media organization, one that is, in some ways, we could almost call it more mainstream and certainly more typical of the big establishment American media stories, said that they had been briefed, perhaps by the same Trump administration source of the same thing, that for the Americans, a meeting between Putin and Zelensky at the summit was an absolute precondition. If the meeting between Trump and Zelensky did not take place, there would be no meeting at all. Well, I have to say that did seem to me most unlikely. As I said already, it was the Americans clearly who pressed for the meeting, or at least Donald Trump pressed for the meeting. There are compelling reasons why Trump might want to meet Putin at this time. Putin has called Trump's bluff on the sanctions and the tariffs, the threats of sanctions against Russia, the threat of secondary tariffs against Russia's trading partners. India, which perhaps President Trump and his officials might have thought would bend, has not done so. It continues to trade with Russia. Indeed, today there are media reports in Reuters which say that India has already begun its own response to the United States. It's stopped buying American weapons, and it's called off the visit by its defense minister to Washington, a scheduled visit by the Indian defense minister to Washington. The Chinese media is now also carrying reports about the possibility of Prime Minister Modi traveling to China to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. And it is pointing out that this is the first time that Modi has visited China in 7 years, and that the Chinese see this as a breakthrough. Modi, by the way, is holding a meeting, a cabinet meeting, to discuss the situation with the United States today. But in the meantime, an Indian government source, or maybe Indian oil ministry source, has again contacted the official Russian TASS news agency and has denied reports which have appeared, I believe, in Bloomberg, that Indian refineries, Indian state companies are not buying Russian oil, that they've stopped in purchases of Russian oil until they get guidance from the Indian government. And I'll just read what this source says. He says, oil companies still purchase Russian oil. Volumes may have declined, though purchases have not stopped. All companies support a commercially advantageous deal. We continue to purchase Russian oil or any other that is cheaper. It is customary practice on the spot market, if the volumes of purchases from different suppliers change from month to month, which is due to price fluctuations, supply conditions, the quality of oil, seasonal demand, and logistics, to adapt purchases. However, the Indian government has made it clear that there is no interruption in Russian oil supplies. Russian oil is not under sanctions. So India continues to buy Russian oil. The reports that have appeared in the media about India scaling down buying of Russian oil are over-representing the normal fluctuations in this kind of trade. India's or doesn't buy oil at the same consistent levels all the time. Whether it does so or not depends on the state of the market. India does not buy oil at the same level all the time. The level of its buying, the quantity of its buying depends on conditions in the market, both the domestic demand for oil and the availability for oil and its price. And I have no doubt, by the way, that this is true. But the point is that President Trump has seen that even India is resisting his demands that Russia be placed under some sort of economic blockade. He understands, I'm sure, the risks for him and for the United States if the United States got drawn into a prolonged economic war, not just against Russia, but against the BRIC states and China in particular, and much of the rest of the global south. And for that reason, and because of the events on the front lines, which I will discuss later in this program, Donald Trump made the request to Putin for a meeting. And it seems illogical, given that it was Trump who sought the meeting, that he would call off the meeting because Putin doesn't want to meet Zelensky. It's Trump that wants the meeting. It's Trump who asked for the meeting. Is he really going to let Zelensky get in the way of a meeting he wants to take place? Anyway, we had many reports over the course of yesterday that Donald Trump was going to make some big announcement late in the evening on the 7th of August. And there were even suggestions, which I saw circulating, that there was going to be some kind of Oval Office address or something of that kind. Well, in the event, there was no real big announcement. There was a press conference of the sort that Donald Trump often has. And he was asked straightforwardly, if Putin won't meet Zelensky, does that mean that you will not meet Putin? And Trump said no. He said no. The implication is that the meeting between himself and Putin is not conditional on a meeting between Putin and Zelensky also taking place. So I think, based on that, we can assume that those reports that the Americans were imposing some kind of condition to the meeting, that Putin meet Zelensky, and that this becomes some kind of tripartite meeting, that those reports were wrong. Here is what I think happened. Clearly, the Americans have tried to bounce the Russians, Putin, into meeting with Zelensky. Putin has never shown any interest in meeting Zelensky. He's repeatedly rejected that idea. He's repeatedly said that there has to be a framework peace settlement first before a meeting between himself and Zelensky can take place. The Americans, however, the Europeans, and of course Zelensky himself, have been relentlessly pushing Putin to agree to a meeting. Trump has his own reasons for wanting to meet Putin, but Trump also knows that if he simply meets Putin, there's going to be an enormous outcry in Europe, in Ukraine, amongst his critics in the United States. We'll come to all of that shortly, and the reasons why he might think that. And in order to give himself cover, and perhaps in order to kickstart the negotiations, or at least the negotiations towards achieving a ceasefire, he tried to bounce Putin into a meeting with Zelensky that Putin had not agreed to in advance. However, the moment Putin said no, I am not prepared to meet with Zelensky, the Americans pulled back. I suspect those reports that appeared in the New York Post and in ABC News were an attempt again to bluff Putin into saying that he would meet Zelensky after all in order to get the summit meeting going. When it became clear that that wasn't going to happen, the Americans realized that their bluff had been called, and Trump confirmed that the meeting is not conditional on the meeting with Zelensky taking place after all. So again, the Russians have won the point. Now, there is an alternative possibility, which is that it's clear to me that not everybody in the administration is happy about the fact that Putin and Trump are going to meet, and not everybody in the administration is happy about the fact that the bone-crushing sanctions that Trump has threatened and Lindsey Graham has demanded are not going to be enacted immediately. We'll come to that in a moment. And that somebody, therefore, was prowling the newspaper offices and the television and studios and was trying to wreck the entire summit before it even happens by spreading the story that unless Putin agreed to meet Zelensky, the entire meeting would be called off. I'm afraid that is not a possibility that can be excluded at all. Anyway, that was the first thing that came out of all of this, out of that press conference yesterday. So it now looks as if definitely Putin is not going to meet Zelensky. The meeting, as the Russians always understood and had agreed to, the meeting is going to be a bilateral meeting, a summit meeting between Trump and Putin, and those two men talking to each other, with Zelensky either not involved at all or only peripherally involved. Again, we'll come to that in a moment. Now, the other thing that Trump said yesterday during this press conference was he was asked whether the ultimatum that he'd imposed on the Russians still applied, the ultimatum that supposedly runs out today. And Trump said that he remained very disappointed, presumably with Putin, but that whether or not the ultimatum would be brought into effect would depend on what Putin said and did, presumably at the summit meeting. Now, again, reports were floating around in Washington yesterday that the sanctions and tariffs, the deadline for the sanctions and tariffs, which runs out today, is still in place. That despite the fact that there's been this agreement to hold the meeting, the United States is nonetheless going to go ahead and impose those tariffs and sanctions later today. Well, that is possible, but it doesn't seem to me to be in accord with what Trump said yesterday. And again, given that it was Trump who asked for the meeting and Trump who wants the meeting, I think it is unlikely that Trump would take steps like imposing sanctions and tariffs, which might persuade Putin that there was little point in having the meeting at all, and it might be better, therefore, simply to call it off. That's a possible. Having said that, it's not impossible that Trump might come to a different conclusion, that imposing the sanctions and the tariffs now might put him in a stronger position when he meets with Putin. In reality, of course, it will do the opposite, but we'll discuss that later. But anyway, it could be that there will be a tariff and sanctions announcement later today. But based on what Trump said yesterday and applying simple logic, it seems to me unlikely. Anyway, there we are. Lots of spinning, lots of attempts to perhaps put pressure on the Russians, perhaps to wreck the summit, all kinds of things going on in Washington yesterday. But the summit, for the moment at least, still seems to be on track. Now, before I move on, I want to go back to that Fox News report about a meeting on the 11th of August and taking place in Rome. I've already said that it is inconceivable that the meeting would happen in Rome, and TASS has essentially confirmed that. And I've also said that since the report that is going to take place in Rome is obviously wrong, that makes it most unlikely that the meeting will indeed happen on the 11th of August, which, frankly, is a very, very short time frame. Indeed, it would mean that the meeting would take place as soon as Monday. Now, here I'm going to say something about superpower summits. I mean, I have remembered many. My memory extends certainly back to the superpower summits of the Nixon-Brezhnev era. And of course, there were superpower summits before then. In some ways, the modern tradition of superpower summits began in 1967 when the US Premier Lyndon Johnson met with the Soviet Premier, the US President Lyndon Johnson met with the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin in Glassboro in the United States. Now, superpower summit meetings of the Cold War era were meticulously prepared in advance. There would be thorough discussion, agreements and agendas. There would be meetings between lower-ranking officials who would prepare the agenda and agree the agenda, and the two leaders, before they met, would have a fairly clear idea both about what they would discuss and about the starting positions of their opposite numbers. That didn't mean that the meetings themselves were purely ceremonial events. Genuine discussion did take place, and very often issues that had up till then held up a final meeting would be ironed out over the course of leader discussions. But, as I said, there would be weeks, often months of preparation before the meeting itself took place. Now, this meeting has every appearance of being completely different. As I said, Witkoff went to Moscow, wanted a meeting, wanted the Russians to agree to a meeting, wanted that meeting to happen as soon as possible. It's not clear whether he came with any kind of proposals or agenda or plan. I will say straight away that I don't believe that there is any kind of agenda or meeting or plan for this meeting. It's just that Trump has this desire, this need to meet Putin because everything is going wrong. The sanctions and tariff bluff has been called. The military situation in Ukraine is coming to a point of crisis. He needs to meet with Putin, or so he thinks, because only through a meeting with Putin and coming to some kind of understanding with Putin can he extricate himself from the situation he finds himself in now. Now, that is not a situation which the Russians are comfortable with at all. They obviously have formed their own understanding of how meetings, superpower meetings, should take place from the long record of superpower summits in the Cold War era. And of course, the structure of superpower summits of the Cold War era was carried on mostly during the post-Cold War era, especially after Putin became president. And of course, Putin himself, as is well known, is a careful, very organized, very methodical, very structured man. He likes to prepare things well in advance. He's not somebody who likes to be catapulted straight into a freewheeling discussion. There is a further reason why Putin may be very concerned and cautious about having a meeting of this kind with Donald Trump, because he also undoubtedly remembers the last time they had a bilateral summit meeting, which is the one that took place in Helsinki in 2018. And that meeting appeared initially to go well. Putin and Trump met. Putin then participated with Trump in a press conference. I covered the meeting in detail at the time. I pointed out how Putin, in his usual very structured way, over the course of the press conference, outlined all of the points of agreement that he and Trump had come to over the course of the meeting, how it looked as if US-Russian relations were going to be put on track. And then, of course, everything fell apart because the media interpreted several comments of Trump's over the course of that very same news conference to mean that Trump was siding with Putin against his intelligence agencies over the Russiagate affair. And there was a massive outcry in the United States. The summit meeting was compared with the Munich meeting between Neville Chamberlain and the Germans in 1938, as it always is. Others went further still and said that the meeting was further evidence of the collusion and conspiracy that was supposedly taking place between Trump and the Russians. This is the time when the Russiagate investigations were still ongoing and when the collusion narrative was still alive in the media, and all the agreements that Putin thought he had reached with Trump over the course of that meeting, that summit meeting in Helsinki, turned to dust. We never heard anything more about them again. Now, I have pointed out in previous programs that if it had in fact been the case that Trump had sided with Putin over the course of that summit meeting in relation to the Russiagate allegations, he would have been right to do so. Because from what we know now, it seems that it was Putin who was telling the truth, or at least more of the truth than the US intelligence community was conveying, both to Trump and to the wider American public at that time. The recent Gabbard disclosures make that, as far as I am concerned, completely clear. But anyway, put that all aside. From Putin's point of view, he clearly must remember vividly that summit meeting. From his point of view, the summit meeting was a disaster. As I said, everything turned to dust in his hands, and he will not want that to happen all over again. And if only for that reason, he would prefer, I am sure, a carefully prepared meeting with a proper agenda and a proper structure and a wide discussion before the meeting takes place between the US and American governments and Russian governments. So when the meeting happens, everybody knows to a certain extent what the other side is going to say. And if agreements or some kind of consensus emerges, this time, unlike what happened in Helsinki, it will last. And I'm sure that that is one of the reasons why Putin probably required an awful lot of persuasion, 3 hours of it, before he finally agreed to the proposal, the American proposal, for a summit meeting to be held in the way that Donald Trump is asking for. Now, this leads me back to that question about a meeting on Monday, 11th August, in Rome. Could it be that Fox News is misunderstanding the sequence of events? Because logically, before a meeting between Putin and Trump takes place, there ought to be a preparatory meeting between US and Russian officials, say Rubio and Witkoff representing the Americans, Lavrov and Ushakov representing the Russians, and conceivably that could happen on Monday in Rome, and it might conceivably pave the way for the meeting to take place later, perhaps later next week, perhaps more plausibly the week after. Just saying. Anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, there is something else, and this comes to what was being said and discussed in Moscow. Because over the course of yesterday, video footage appeared of Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, speaking to Russian journalists. And it took place in the Kremlin. I'm assuming it happened directly after Ushakov gave his commentary about the meeting between Putin and Witkoff, the long commentary which I discussed yesterday. The journalists who were from the Kremlin press pool were very aggressive and were badgering Ushakov to answer questions about the summit. For the record, Ushakov, to me, looked absolutely exhausted. But anyway, at some point over the course of this question and answer, this very rapid fire question and answer, Ushakov said that the Russians had received an acceptable proposal from the Americans. And there's been a whole massive structure of speculation based around those words. It's been suggested that some kind of final agreement has been reached between the Americans and the Russians, that Putin and Trump are going to meet to sign off on this deal. There's even been some reporting which sets out what this deal is going to be. The reporting, when I looked into it, appears to originate with some reporting from a single Polish magazine. I don't take it seriously. It speaks about ceasefires and de facto recognitions of territory in Ukraine, but it doesn't mention any restriction on Ukraine's future NATO membership, for example. I'm very, very skeptical, to put it mildly, about this Polish report. I was, at least from the moment I first saw it. But anyway, the Ukrainians themselves have denied it. They said that they have no reason to believe that this report is true, and I don't believe it either. Ushakov has been unbelievably busy over the last couple of days. He is 78 years old, and though he's obviously very full of energy, or at least an energetic man, certainly he has to be, to keep up with Putin. I mentioned how punishing Putin's schedule is, and over the course of the last couple of days, Ushakov has attended meetings with Putin, with Witkoff, and with the King of Malaysia, and with Modi's national security advisor. And I'm guessing that he also attended the meeting between Putin and the president of the UAE. So all of this in a very, very short period of time. And of course, you can imagine that Ushakov has also been busy briefing members of the Russian bureaucracy about the discussions that took place between Witkoff and Putin, and perhaps was talking to foreign leaders as well, or at least foreign governments as well. And of course, he had to draw up and write the memorandum that he read out to the media yesterday. So it's understandable that he would be exhausted, and to me, he looked as if he was exhausted. And for the record, I think his comment about an acceptable proposal refers to the agreement to hold the summit meeting. I don't think it extends to anything more than that. That's my view at the moment of Ushakov's words. I wouldn't analyze them beyond that. I've heard and seen no hints of any bigger, broader understanding between Putin and Trump up to now. Nothing about the way in which this meeting has been organized suggests to me that there is a broader understanding of any kind at all. Of course, it may be that I'm wrong. It may be that they've agreed on some matters. We'll just have to see. But if so, I've seen no hint of it. And if there had been that kind of broader understanding, I would have thought that by now in Washington, certainly, we would be seeing some reports of it. So anyway, that's where we are. As I said, a day yesterday full of spin and speculation and rumour. But where we stand at the moment is that Putin and Trump are going to meet, probably in some Arab country, probably the UAE. It doesn't look to me yet as if there's any sort of agreed agenda. It looks, again, also as if the ultimatum that was supposed to expire today has been quietly extended until after the summit meeting takes place. And it looks for the moment as if Zelensky himself is not going to be there. Now, I say not going to be there. A possible compromise between the American and the Russian positions is that Zelensky does come to whatever is the location of the summit, let's say Abu Dhabi, and that he's hanging around in the hotel rooms in Abu Dhabi until Trump and Putin have finished their discussion, and that Trump then meets with Zelensky and briefs him about what took place. It's close to what Zelensky has done in the past. I mean, he attempted to gate crash a meeting between the Russians and the Americans in Riyadh, which took place in March. He was trying to get to Riyadh. The Saudis stopped him going. He tried to gate crash the first meeting between the Ukrainians and the Russians in Istanbul back in May. He went to Ankara, where he had a long meeting with Erdogan, who basically told him to appoint negotiators and go home. To my mind, it would be massively undignified if Zelensky turned up in Abu Dhabi and hung around hotel rooms waiting to speak to Trump after the two big boys, Putin and Trump, had finished their discussions. But dignity is not a word I associate with Zelensky, and perhaps that is what he's going to do. I can't see the point of it myself, but there it is. Now, the Europeans yesterday apparently received the news that Putin and Trump were going to meet relatively calmly, but that was all on the basis that Zelensky would be there. Now that it's looking as if Zelensky is not going to be there, one senses that they are less happy. The media in Britain, I notice, has basically stopped reporting the story about the summit meeting between Putin and Trump. Clearly, there is nervousness about reporting it. And I'm going to make a guess. I think they've been given a steer by the British government to downplay the story. Zelensky himself is said to be in a complete panic. He is busy calling all his friends in Europe, trying desperately to speak to them. He's trying to rally the Europeans, as he has repeatedly done, to back him in any showdown with Trump, so that if Trump makes concessions to Putin at Ukraine's expense at the summit meeting, the Europeans will stand behind Zelensky. And in the meantime, he's hoping that the Europeans will put pressure on Trump to prevent him from making any concessions to Putin. But the reports from Kiev itself actually use the word panic to describe Zelensky's mood. And it must seem to Zelensky that after all that's happened over the last couple of weeks, his meetings with Trump, his various conversations with Trump, the comments from Trump about how angry he was and disappointed he was with Putin, the statements that were made last month by Trump about how he was going to impose a deadline on Putin to make a deal within 50 days and then 10 days, or face crushing sanctions and tariffs against Russia's trading partners. It must seem to Zelensky that all of that suddenly, this impressive edifice that has been worked upon so laboriously by Zelensky himself and by his European friends, that it's suddenly all tottering and looks like it might be about to collapse. So it is not surprising if suddenly he is in a panic and is trying to rally all his European friends. And again, emphasizing the level of chaos, it seems that when Trump briefed the Europeans, they couldn't find, or they couldn't contact all of the European leaders that they needed to speak to, with the result that some were left out of the calls. Again, given the rushed and hurried way in which this has all been put together, none of that surprises me. Now, what can come out of a summit meeting which has been organized and put together in this chaotic and hasty way? To be frank, I don't think very much. I think that Putin will use the opportunity, as I discussed already, to try to educate Trump in the history of the conflict. The Wall Street Journal says that when Putin and Trump have their telephone conversations, the tone between the two men is always friendly and polite. It says that Putin does more of the talking, with Trump impatient and agitated and frustrated sometimes because he can't interject, but he always listens very attentively to all the things that Putin is saying. I'm going to give Putin here some completely unsolicited advice. If Putin has a fault, is that he does engage in lengthy lectures, didactic lectures about this crisis, which of course he knows in intimate detail. I think it might work better for him if over the course of this meeting, he listens more and perhaps lectures a little less. Just saying. But perhaps, possibly, as Marco Rubio says, the Americans will come away with a better understanding of the Russian position. And maybe, just possibly, they can move on to topics unconnected to Ukraine, where they might have serious things to talk about. Arms control is one of them. I've already discussed in series of programs how bad the situation is in terms of arms control. The Russians have ended their own restrictions, their self-imposed restrictions, in relation to deployment of intermediate nuclear missiles. The START treaty is hanging by a thread. I would have thought that resuming serious arms control negotiations is in everybody's interests. I can't imagine that even the most diehard neoconservatives in Washington can legitimately, or at least publicly, object to proper negotiating teams meeting to talk about arms control. Just saying. Well, perhaps one shouldn't expect too much or anything too reasonable from those people. But anyway, I would have thought that there would be little political cost and some political gain to at least getting the nuclear arms talks resuming again. I would, for the moment at least, put aside economic agreements. I know this is of burning interest to Donald Trump, and it might work out for the future, but I would leave that to Witkoff and Dmitriev to sort out between them. I would, by the way, take some steps, overdue steps, to regularize Witkoff's position. If he's going to be appointed National Security Advisor, then why not do it? It would at least give him a staff. And anyway, hold that kind of discussion. As for Ukraine, I think the best advice that Putin can give to Trump is to tell Trump, wait, because the military situation on the battlefronts is moving rapidly to the point, I would have thought, fairly to the point when the Russians might become more amenable to at least temporary halts to hostilities. I say that because the military situation is such that it seems to me that the Russians are very soon going to be in control, possibly by the end of the year, are going to be in control of all of the territory of the four regions. So it will no longer be an issue for Ukraine whether a ceasefire on the conflict line still leaves Ukraine in control of some of the four regions, because by then the Russians will control all of them, just to say. And to the extent that this has ever been a sticking point, a genuine sticking point in the negotiations, it's something that could be resolved quite quickly. Trump has already spoken about the fact that he is not in favor of Ukraine's NATO membership. I would, if I was Putin, I would say to Trump, leave the situation, the negotiations, to the Ukrainians and to us. Support our meetings in Istanbul. The Ukrainians are losing on the battlefronts. Maybe at that point, when the four regions have fully passed under our control, a more serious negotiation between us and you, that is to say the United States and Russia, about Ukraine can take place. But at that point, it won't just be about Ukraine. It will be about the general security framework in Europe. So that's perhaps the best that I can see coming out of these talks. We'll see. We will see what happens. Sometimes when leaders meet, all kinds of surprising things happen, and it may be that we will get surprises out of this meeting. With such an unpredictable leader as Donald Trump, that is a possibility that cannot be excluded. Now, of course, there are many people who will say, and there are many people in Russia who will say, that all negotiations between the Americans and the Russians are a completely pointless exercise. Whatever agreements the Russians think they've reached with the Americans are not going to honor. I understand that reasoning. Putin himself has talked about it many times. He has admitted that there is force to it. I think nonetheless, given the power of the United States, the option of not speaking to the Americans is one that the Russians don't realistically have. And I think that the Russians probably calculate that so long as they don't make any concessions on any fundamental issues to the Americans, then keeping a dialogue with the Americans going plays out to their long-term advantage. Anyway, that's where we are. We will see what happens over the next couple of days, whether there is a meeting on Monday, what comes of that meeting, whether there is a summit meeting, where it takes place, what Putin and Xi Jinping have been saying to each other in the meantime. Anyway, there is an awful lot to see, but let me reiterate again. The key thing to understand about this summit meeting is that it was the Americans who sought it, the Russians who agreed to it. The advantage, therefore, is with the Russians. They're in the driving seat. They have agreed to something that the Americans asked for. If things go wrong, if the Americans start making unreasonable demands, the Russians do have the option of simply saying, well, meeting at this time clearly isn't a good idea. Let's postpone it till later. And that's not something I think that the Americans, that Donald Trump want to see happen at all. The fact that all the reports speak of panic in Kiev, and that all of the reports also speak of growing alarm in European capitals, tell you that it is the Russians currently who have the advantage. Now, that brings me to the situation on the battlefronts, because it ought to be obvious, again, that the fact that the Russians are winning the war is what is driving everything. To repeat a point I've made in the past, and which many people perhaps don't fully get, if the Russians were not winning the war, if it really was a stalemate situation in Ukraine, or if the Russians were in fact losing the war, then we will be in a completely different situation entirely. We would not have threats of bone-crushing sanctions against the Russians. We would not have the Americans chasing the Russians, trying to get summit meetings set up. We would have escalating demands against the Russians, demands which would be completely different from the ones we are seeing now. So what is happening at the present time on the battlefields in Ukraine? Well, the answer is that the situation continues to deteriorate, and it is deteriorating very fast. The biggest and most important battle is the battle for Pokrovsk. And here, the Ukrainians have themselves published video film, which confirms conclusively that the Russian military is now present in central Pokrovsk. Now, again, the Ukrainian reporting speaks of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups. It's sort of implying that this is some kind of temporary presence by Russian reconnaissance groups operating inside Pokrovsk. After something like 10 days of this going on, this makes no sense at all. It's clearly the Russian army that has broken through Pokrovsk and is in central Pokrovsk. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that the Russians control most or half of Pokrovsk. I get the sense that they control perhaps 10 to 20% of it at most. And when I say 10 to 20% of it, a large part of that area appears to consist of the Jubilee Park, the Jubiliani Park, which of course is open ground. It is not built up ground. But the footage not only shows the Russians in central Pokrovsk, but it shows the Russians, so far as I can see, north of the E50 road. North of the E50 road in central Pokrovsk. Not where the E50 road enters Pokrovsk, but right in the center of the town. And this is important because it seems as if the strongest Ukrainian position in Pokrovsk is located in the Shakhtarsky micro-district. This is apparently an area of high-rise buildings, very much like the high-rise buildings in Ugledar and in Volchansk. It is, in other words, a natural, not natural, but it's a built-up area which is well adapted to becoming a kind of citadel, a fortress area. The Ukrainians have heavily fortified it. It is located in the southeastern section of Pokrovsk, and importantly, it is south of the E50 road. In fact, it is bordered by a road to the east, which separates the Shakhtarsky micro-district from the Jubiliani Park area, and the northern border of this micro-district is the E50 road. It's like a kind of island with the two roads, these two roads forming the boundary. Now, presumably, the Ukrainian troops in this micro-district have received their supplies from the road, the E50 road, and also from the northern road, which also reaches south to the Shakhtarsky micro-district, the same northern road that passes through Belitskaya and Rodinska. Now, if the Russians have crossed the road and are operating in the central area of Pokrovsk, then the E50 road cannot be used any longer by the Ukrainians to supply the troops, their troops, who are holding their positions in this Shakhtarsky micro-district. I doubt that the Ukrainians can send many supplies through the northern road that passes through Rodinska, and Bielitska to the north, Belitskaya to the north. So it seems to me as if the Ukrainian troops in this Shakhtarsky micro-district are, to all intents and purposes, already cut off from supplies. And there are reports that the Russians are now seeking to capture a village called Novopavlivka. There are lots of villages in Ukraine called Novopavlivka. This is not to be confused with the much bigger town of Novopavlivka in Dnipropetrovsk region, which the Russians are incrementally surrounding. But anyway, it seems as if the Russians are now trying to capture this place, Novopavlivka, and that the Russians have already captured another village to the south of Novopavlivka called Chunishine, which is located north of Novoukrainka, which is a village that they captured some days ago. Now, if this is all correct, then the Ukrainian troops in the Shakhtarsky micro-district are in effect surrounded. The Russians have, perhaps not completely, but mostly surrounded these Ukrainian troops in the Shakhtarsky micro-district and cut them off from supplies. Now, it's likely that the Russians haven't yet fully thickened out their positions, that it's likely that the Russian troops in central Pokrovsk are not there in large numbers. The Russians still need to clear more territory, to capture more territory in north and western Pokrovsk. And in order to consolidate their control, the Russians also need to capture Rodinska and Belitska to the north. But once that happens, as I said, this fortified area in southeastern Pokrovsk will be in a cauldron. The Ukrainian troops there will be in a cauldron. And though, as I said, this place is heavily fortified and consists of high-rise buildings, if the troops are cut off, if they can't get supplies, then they can only hold out for a relatively short time, because however big the stocks of ammunition which have been built up there, those stocks will start to run down. And of course, before long, men start to run short of other supplies, food, water, essential medical supplies as well. The Ukrainians have in the past resupplied troops who find themselves in these kind of situations using drones. They did this during the Krinky operation. As I remember, this is the one where Ukrainian troops were landed in Kherson region, on the east bank of Kherson region, only to be surrounded by the Russians. But the Ukrainians kept the troops there supplied, as I said, using drone drops. But today, this time, the Russians are in such complete control of the sky that I doubt that this is practical. So all of the indications are that the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk are in an effective cauldron. Perhaps there is still opportunities to escape north to the northwest through the village of Grishine. But given that the Ukrainians are in the southwest of Pokrovsk, concentrated in this micro-district, that might not be so easy. Now, here we can see that the Ukrainians, in their rush to defend Pokrovsk, to fortify Pokrovsk, as the Russians approached it, in the summer and autumn of last year appear to have misjudged the situation. They appear to have assumed that the Russians would attack Pokrovsk from the south, thus the heavy emphasis on fortifying the Shakhtarsky micro-district. They underestimated the possibility that the Russians would break through to the north, east of Pokrovsk, threatening the supply loads from the north, and they also appear to have underestimated the possibility that the Russians would be able to advance into the center of Pokrovsk through the southwest, through the Yubileyny Park. Just saying. Now, there's been more news from Pokrovsk as well. There are reports that the Russians have now captured the Krasno Liman mine to the west, to the east of Rodinska. There's also reports that there's still fighting going on in the Dimitrov mine between Novoekonomichny and Mirnograd. Impossible to verify these reports, by the way. The various mapping projects are showing the grey zone, the area where fighting is supposed to be taking place, northeast of Pokrovsk, getting bigger and bigger, which confirms Russian advances. For the record, I think the Russians control securely nearly all of this territory. And there are reports now that the Russians have now finished, finally, the Battle of Udachnye, the village along the railways to the southwest of Pokrovsk and of Kotlino, which the Russians captured back in the autumn of last year. Now, the fall of Udachnye opens up the possibility of the Russians advancing north from Udachnye, capturing another coal mine, and cutting the E50 road from the north. But if they have already cut the E50 road in central Pokrovsk, it's not obvious why it is pressingly important for them to do that. But anyway, that is the news, as far as I can see it as it's playing out in Pokrovsk. An incredibly intense battle, but one which is taking a disastrous turn. It's starting to look to me as if the Shakhtarsky micro-district is becoming the Pokrovsk equivalent of the factory, the Azovstal factory in Mariupol, where the defenders of Mariupol, the Ukrainian defenders of Mariupol, were basically encircled and were forced to surrender in the spring and summer of 2022. Now, there's a lot of things going on in all sorts of other places as well. There continue to be many, many reports that the Russians now have plans to capture the southern part of the city of Kherson. This is, as I said, an effective island. They are supposed to be, the Russians are supposed to be close to cutting this area of the southern town of southern Kherson completely from resupply. There are reports that General Teplinsky's forces, General Teplinsky, of course, knows Kherson extremely well. He fought to defend it in 2022, just saying. But anyway, there are lots of reports that the Russians are sending boats to the east bank of the Dnieper, that General Teplinsky is concentrating more and more troops in this area. We'll just have to wait and see. The Ukrainian garrison in Kherson is said to be very small and unlikely to be able to withstand a Russian attack. I'm not saying it's not coming. All I'm saying is there's a lot of reports about this, but no attack so far has taken place that I'm aware of. It is now universally accepted that the Ukrainian troops south of the Kliban-Bik reservoir, south of Konstantinovka, are indeed in a cauldron. And footage appeared yesterday which showed Russian armor in the village of Katerinovka, which is one of the two remaining villages that the Ukrainians controlled in this area, the other being the village of Kliban-Bik. It's been suggested that the only way that the Ukrainians can now escape from this trap would be by using boats to cross the reservoir. I would have thought that that would be a disaster. Russian drones would now be operating constantly over the reservoir. Any boats trying to evacuate Ukrainian personnel from south of the Kliban-Bik reservoir would be immediately spotted by the Russians and would be destroyed by the Russian drones. Perhaps some brave souls will try to swim across the reservoir. Things like that happen. I'm not going to say that nobody can escape this cauldron. Perhaps some people can. But a cauldron there is. I don't know how many people are trapped in it. Now, earlier today, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the village, that another village in this area has now been captured by the Russians. I believe it is Alexandro Kalinovo, which of course confirms this is a place south of this reservoir. It confirms the existence of the cauldron. Now, further to the east, there are also reports that the Russians have now captured most of the village of Kolodizy near Liman, and that they are approaching other villages closer to Liman itself, and that the Russians are surrounding Ukrainian troops who are still trying to defend themselves in the Serebyanka forest. There was a long report about this on Radovka yesterday. It looks as if the two towns of Liman and Siversk are under intense pressure. And footage has also appeared which appears to confirm that the Russians do indeed control all of the villages to the west and south of Kupiansk, and that Kupiansk, in effect, is also operationally encircled, and fighting apparently is continuing to take place in Kupiansk. I suspect that the reason that Kupiansk is taking a long time to clear, like Chasiv Yar, is because the Russians are not deploying large numbers of troops to Kupiansk, just as they didn't to Chasiv Yar. For comparison, the Ukrainians say that there's around 100,000 Russian troops encircling and storming Pokrovsk. That compares with a force of about 8,000 Russian troops that cleared Chasiv Yar, and I would not be surprised if the Russian forces committed to clearing Kupiansk are about the same size. So anyway, the point is that the Russian advance, the offensive by the Russians, continues. There's been more reports of more missile strikes by the Russians over the last missile and drone strikes by the Russians, especially against targets in Odessa. It seems that more of the jet-powered Geran 3 drones were used in these strikes. I saw a report that far from the Ukrainians being able to shoot down 95% of the Geran drones that are launched by the Russians, the actual percentage of Geran drones, Geran 2s and Geran 3s that the Ukrainians shoot down is closer to 20 to 25%. I can't obviously verify those numbers. Who's to say whether they are true? Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. As I said, a major crisis in Pokrovsk for the Ukrainians. It seems to me that the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk are already in a virtual cauldron. It may not have fully sealed, as Pushilin said, but we are very close to that point now. Now, I'm going to finish this program by returning to the topic of the situation in Gaza. Yesterday, the Israeli cabinet authorized Prime Minister Netanyahu's directive to the Israeli army to occupy the entire territory of the Gaza Strip. Apparently, this is according to the London Times, there's been a fierce argument between Netanyahu and the Israeli military about this. The Israeli military have said that this makes no military sense, that occupying the entire Gaza Strip is not going to defeat or destroy Hamas. It's going to involve the Israelis in another long battle with an uncertain outcome. And by the way, I've also been reading that supposedly there's been a furious row over the phone between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, with Trump furious because Netanyahu was denying that there is hunger in Gaza. Well, all of this may be true. The generals may indeed be pushing back. President Trump may be unhappy. But the reality is that the horror in Gaza continues. I too don't believe that occupying the whole of Gaza is going to resolve any of the military problems that the Israelis say they expect it to resolve. All I am sure it will do is that it will intensify and worsen the already catastrophic situation that already exists there. The Israelis apparently are denying reports that they intend to annex Gaza. If you believe those denials, then I'm sorry for you, because I have no doubt that that is indeed their plan. This nightmare, this horror, continues to play out. I don't believe there's going to be any early resolution or end to this. To repeat again what I said in a recent program, I believe that this will again become a major topic for diplomatic action in the autumn. And I think this is something else that President Trump needs to prepare for. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And of course, don't forget also to look at our shop. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.